At 9:15 a.m. on August 23, 1914, near the Belgian town of Mons, 2 British machine guns held the line against an entire German army. The 4th Battalion of the Royal Fusiliers had been ordered to defend a narrow bridge over the Mons Canal and to hold it at all costs. By midday, both guns were silent. One officer was dead, another gravely wounded, and nearly every man in the section had been killed or captured. But for 3 crucial hours, they delayed the advance of 160,000 German troops long enough to save the British Expeditionary Force from encirclement. This is the story of the first British battle of World War I, and how a handful of professional soldiers faced the full power of modern war for the first time. The British Expeditionary Force arrived in Belgium on August 22, 1914. It was small, just 80,000 men, a professional army trained in colonial wars, not industrial ones. They called themselves the Old Contemptibles. Their officers carried revolvers polished by hand. Their uniforms were pressed, their boots shined. Most believed they'd be home by Christmas. At dawn the next day, German patrols from the First Army under General Alexander von Kluck were already across the frontier. They numbered more than 500,000 men, backed by heavy artillery, air reconnaissance, and machine guns. Their orders were to sweep south, crush the French left flank, and annihilate the small British force guarding it. The first collision would happen at Mons, a quiet mining town with a canal running through its center. That canal would become a killing ground. The 4th Royal Fusiliers were positioned at a key crossing known as Nimy Bridge. 2 Vickers machine guns covered the road. Commanding them was Lieutenant Maurice Deese, 24 years old, calm, methodical, professional. Beside him was Private Sidney Godley, the gunner assigned to feed the ammunition belts. Their mission was simple: hold the bridge until ordered to withdraw. No one explained how long that would be. At 9 a.m., the first German scouts appeared along the far bank of the canal. Moments later, entire battalions moved into view, lines of gray uniforms stretching across the fields. When they reached the open ground, the Fusiliers opened fire. British riflemen, trained to fire 15 aimed shots per minute, cut down the first waves with precision. German survivors later wrote that they believed they were facing massed machine guns, not riflemen. It was the last time in history that a small professional army could stand toe-to-toe with an industrial one. But the odds were impossible. German field guns found the range. Shells burst among the brick houses and iron railings of the bridge. Deese was hit twice, but refused to leave his post. He continued to direct fire until a 3rd wound forced him to collapse behind the parapet. Private Godley took over the gun alone, loading, cooling, and firing while shrapnel tore through the position. He stayed for hours, firing until he ran out of ammunition. By midday, both guns were destroyed. The canal was littered with wreckage, helmets, rifles, and bodies floating among the reeds. When German troops finally crossed, they found the guns unmanned and the bridge empty. The survivors of the 4th Fusiliers had already withdrawn to secondary positions. The delay they caused saved thousands of British soldiers along the line from being overrun. Lieutenant Deese died of his wounds that afternoon. Private Godley was captured, severely wounded, and spent the rest of the war as a prisoner. Both men received the Victoria Cross, the first awarded in the Great War. That day marked the end of an era. The British Army had entered the war with polished discipline and precision rifle fire. They left Mons knowing that courage and marksmanship could not stop artillery and machine guns. The war had changed, and so had the world. By the afternoon of August 23, 1914, the battle for Mons was lost. The British Expeditionary Force had fought for 6 hours against overwhelming odds. They had inflicted heavy casualties on the Germans, but the line was broken. Across the 20-mile front, British battalions were being outflanked. German artillery had crossed the canal. Infantry were moving through the town. If they stayed, the BEF would be surrounded and destroyed. General Sir Horace Smith-Doring, commanding the Second Corps, gave the only order that could save them: withdraw immediately. The order rippled down the line, from corps to division, from battalion to platoon. It meant leaving behind positions that had been held since dawn, abandoning wounded men who couldn't move, and retreating through towns already burning under shellfire. But the alternative was annihilation. As night fell, the British columns began to move south. They marched in silence, boots echoing on cobblestones, rifles slung, faces black with soot. Behind them, Mons was burning. German artillery continued to shell the canal, unaware that most of their targets were already gone. At Nimy Bridge, the position held by the 4th Royal Fusiliers was gone. The guns lay twisted and melted in place. Lieutenant Dease had been carried back only a few hundred yards before dying of his wounds. Private Godley, bleeding from the head and leg, had been captured near the bridge after destroying the weapon to prevent its capture. For their actions that morning, both men would later receive the Victoria Cross, the first two of the war. The retreat from Mons became a test of endurance. In 2 days, the BEF marched more than 60 miles under constant pursuit. The men were exhausted, dehydrated, and demoralized. Rain turned the roads to mud. Horse-drawn wagons sank into ditches. Columns of refugees clogged every route, civilians pushing carts filled with what remained of their lives. British soldiers gave them water, then kept moving. There was no time to rest. German cavalry patrols pressed close behind, probing for weak points. At every village, rearguard companies turned and fought to buy another hour. They dug shallow trenches, fired a few volleys, then fell back again. Each stand delayed the German advance, just long enough for the main force to stay intact. On August 25th, the British reached La Cateau, a small town south of Cambrai. There, Smith Doring made a controversial decision. Despite orders from Field Marshal Sir John French to keep retreating, he chose to stand and fight. His men were exhausted. Many could barely walk. Ammunition was running low. But he knew that if they didn't stop, the Germans would catch the rear columns and destroy the army piecemeal. At dawn on August 26th, German guns opened fire. The Battle of La Cateau had begun. It was the second major engagement of the British Expeditionary Force, and it nearly ended in disaster. For 9 hours, British artillery duels and rifle fire held off superior forces until the line cracked. The cost was staggering, nearly 8,000 British casualties in one day. But once again, they bought time. The retreat continued, ordered and organized, not chaotic. By the end of August, the BEF had withdrawn across the River Marne. They had lost 15,000 men, a fifth of their strength, but they were still intact. And because they survived, they would be there when the tide finally turned. Mons became more than a battle. It became a legend. Newspapers back home spoke of the Angels of Mons, stories of ghostly archers who appeared in the smoke to defend the British lines. The myth spread quickly, bringing comfort to families who had sons fighting in France. But those who were there knew the truth. What saved them that day wasn't divine intervention. It was discipline, training, and the sacrifice of men like Dease and Godley, who held the bridge long enough for the rest to escape. The Battle of Mons was the first encounter between British troops and the German army in the First World War. It would not be the last. But it showed both sides what modern war truly meant, and that the days of quick victories were over. By late morning on August 23, 1914, the sound of rifle fire had become constant, a rolling thunder that shook the air. The canal was now hidden by smoke and dust. Houses burned. Telephone lines hung like torn wires over craters. Messages barely made it through. The British Expeditionary Force was fighting blind. On the right flank, near Oberg, the Royal Irish Regiment was under direct assault. German infantry advanced in dense waves, shouting orders through the haze. Each time they came, British riflemen cut them down, 15 aimed rounds per minute, just like training. But for every line that fell, another appeared. It was no longer a battle of tactics. It was a battle of endurance. At Nimy Bridge, where Lieutenant Dease had already been carried back, Private Godley kept firing. Alone now, he worked the Vickers gun by instinct. The water jacket was empty. The barrel glowed red. He tore open ration tins and poured their contents into the gun to cool it. Every belt of ammunition he fed meant another minute gained for the retreat. When the last box was empty, he stayed on the gun, firing single rounds by hand, refusing to leave. Across the canal, German marksmen closed in. The bridge became a trap of splinters and iron. Godley was hit in the head and shoulder, but kept firing. When the position was finally overrun, he disabled the gun, threw the lock into the canal, and crawled away through the rubble. He would be captured hours later. His stand had lasted nearly 4 hours. 4 hours that saved an army. Further west, the 4th Middlesex Regiment fought to hold the railway bridge near Gmaps. Their trenches were shallow, dug into the gravel of the embankment. When German shells began landing, entire sections vanished. Captain Ashburner later wrote that the ground lifted, like a carpet under each explosion. Still, they held. Each regiment along the canal fought its own private war, disconnected, isolated, but united by the same command: hold. By noon, the German artillery was relentless. Shells fell every few seconds. Bridges splintered. Signals broke down. Units no longer knew what was happening to their neighbors. Commanders relied on messengers, runners crossing open streets under fire, many never returning. The British line was beginning to bend. Then came the cavalry. German Uhlans, long lances, black pennants snapping in the smoke, charged the retreating British columns. They were met by concentrated rifle fire. Entire squadrons went down in seconds. One observer later said it looked like a field of wheat cut by the wind. The old traditions of war, horses, sabers, gallantry, were dying in front of everyone's eyes. What replaced them was steel, gas, and mathematics. At 1:30 p.m., orders reached the surviving positions: withdraw to secondary defenses. But for many, it was already too late. Communications had collapsed. Some units never received the message and kept fighting long after the rest had gone. When the Germans finally crossed the canal, they found empty trenches filled with spent cartridges and silence. For the men who survived, the retreat was chaos turned mechanical. No sleep, no rest, just miles of mud and smoke. The heat of battle replaced by the exhaustion of survival. They left behind comrades who could not move, officers who refused to go, and guns that had fired until the barrels split. The Battle of Mons had lasted less than a single day, but for the soldiers who lived through it, it felt like years compressed into hours. They had faced an empire and held it long enough to prove that courage still mattered, even when courage alone could not win. As the last British units disappeared into the south, the German First Army paused to reorganize. Their officers expected pursuit to begin at once. Instead, the German troops stopped. They had seen what the British riflemen could do. They had seen the discipline of men who fought to the last cartridge. And even the victors hesitated before moving on. That hesitation, a few hours bought by a handful of men, would ripple through the next 2 weeks of war. It gave France time to recover. It gave the Allies time to regroup. And it turned the small town of Mons into one of the first symbols of resistance in the Great War. The battle was over. But for the men of the British Expeditionary Force, the war had just begun. When night fell on August 23rd, the survivors withdrew under cover of darkness. They marched through ruined villages and burning fields. The roads were lined with civilians, old men, women, and children, pushing carts filled with whatever they could carry. Some waved. Others just stared in silence, their faces gray with fear. To them, the British soldiers looked like ghosts, exhausted, silent, covered in mud and blood. By morning, the retreat had become an endless column. Artillery, cavalry, ammunition wagons. Tens of thousands of men moving south. No one knew where the next line would be drawn. The only order was to keep moving. The air smelled of oil and sweat. The rumble of artillery echoed behind them. Every few miles, they'd stop to fight. A quick skirmish, a few bursts of rifle fire, and then back on the road. The Germans were always close. Scouts reported cavalry patrols shadowing their flanks. Every time they rested, someone would whisper, "They're coming," and they'd march again. By August 24th, many had gone more than 30 miles without sleep. Feet blistered, lips cracked. Some collapsed by the roadside and never got up. Their comrades stepped over them, too tired to speak. For every regiment, the retreat was the same: discipline, silence, and endurance. In the small town of Binch, British rear guards made a brief stand. They fought from behind stone walls, firing until the rifles jammed from dust. German machine guns answered instantly, sweeping the streets, cutting down anyone who moved. When the British withdrew, they left the dead where they fell. There was no time for burial. At night, the men camped in fields still warm from the day's artillery fire. They ate dry biscuits, drank from muddy ditches, and tried to sleep under the sound of distant guns. Some dreamed of home. Others didn't dream at all. Letters written in those days show the exhaustion setting in. One corporal wrote, "We are always moving. I have not taken my boots off for 4 days." The men can hardly stand, but the order is the same. Keep marching. The Germans are behind us, and the only thing between us and death is the road. By August 25th, the German First Army was pressing hard. Aerial reconnaissance, a new weapon of this war, reported British columns stretching for miles. From above, it looked like a retreat, but to the men below, it felt like survival. Each regiment fought its own delaying action. A company here, a platoon there, small pockets of resistance that bought hours at a time, sometimes minutes. Every delay mattered. In those days, stories began to spread. Quiet whispers passed between soldiers and villagers. Men claimed they had seen something in the smoke above Mons. Shapes of light, like shining archers, appearing over the canal when the Germans crossed. Some swore they heard voices shouting, "Forward! St. George is with us." Others said it was a trick of the light, reflections from burning oil or shattered glass. But the stories grew. By September, newspapers in London were calling it the Angels of Mons. It became legend, a symbol of divine protection for the soldiers at the front and hope for the families back home. Historians would later trace the myth to a short story published by author Arthur Mahan, a fictional account inspired by medieval archers coming to the aid of British troops. But those who had fought there didn't argue. For them, the angels were real enough, because something had saved them, whether it was faith, discipline, or the sacrifice of men like Dease and Godley, who never came back. When the BEF finally crossed the Marne in early September, they had marched over 250 miles in 15 days. They had lost 1 in every 5 men, but they were still standing, and that mattered more than victory. For the first time, Britain understood what kind of war this would be. There would be no quick end, no glory, no triumphant return by Christmas. Mons had been a warning. The old world had died on the banks of that canal. What came next would consume a generation. By the first week of September 1914, the British Expeditionary Force was no longer retreating. It was regrouping. The German advance had pushed deep into France. Paris was only 30 miles away. Civilians were fleeing in panic, filling the roads with carts and livestock. And then, suddenly, the German tide stopped. On September 6th, the French counterattacked along the River Marne. It was a desperate gamble. Every reserve thrown into the line. Every taxi in Paris used to carry men to the front. For the first time since the war began, the Germans were forced to fall back. The British rejoined the fight, their numbers thin, but their discipline intact. They had survived Mons and Le Cateau, and now they were part of the counterstroke that saved France. The Battle of the Marne changed everything. The German Schlieffen Plan, the grand design to crush France in 6 weeks, had failed. What followed was chaos. Both armies tried to outflank each other, racing north in what became known as the Race to the Sea. It was not a race for territory. It was a race for advantage, for position, for survival. By October, both sides had dug in. First shallow pits, then deeper trenches, then entire networks of tunnels and bunkers. The front solidified, a line stretching from the North Sea to the Swiss border, more than 400 miles long. Neither side would move it significantly for the next 4 years. The British soldiers who had fought at Mons were among the first to occupy those new positions. They dug into the chalk and mud with shovels and bayonets. The trenches were primitive, narrow, collapsing, half filled with water. But they offered one thing that open ground could not: a chance to live through the day. Each morning, the same ritual. Dawn stand to. Rifle bolts checked. Eyes scanning the horizon for movement through the mist. German lines were close, sometimes only 60 yards away. Close enough to hear coughing. Close enough to smell breakfast cooking on the other side. The veterans of Mons called it the quiet death. Not the fury of battle, but the endless waiting. The mud, the rats, the cold, the knowledge that tomorrow might be another bombardment, or another failed attack, or just another day of nothing at all. Letters from the front grew shorter. Some men stopped writing altogether. The excitement of early August, the belief that they were fighting for civilization, for glory, had vanished. What remained was duty, and the quiet pride of those who had survived what so many others hadn't. By December 1914, the survivors of Mons were unrecognizable. Their uniforms were torn, their eyes hollow, their faces aged years and months. Out of the original 80,000 men of the BEF, less than half were still in the line. The rest were dead, wounded, or missing. But those who remained had become something else. Not soldiers of the old world, but soldiers of a new kind of war. They understood the value of cover, of patience, of silence. They learned to listen for the whistle of incoming shells before they landed. They learned that courage wasn't charging forward. It was staying where you were, hour after hour, in the mud, under fire, and not breaking. In one letter written from the front that winter, a captain of the Middlesex Regiment summed it up. We used to think of war as movement. Now it is a line of mud and fear, and men who refuse to die. The line born at Mons would become the Western Front, a scar across Europe that swallowed millions. The British soldiers who first dug in there didn't know it yet, but they were building the stage for every battle that would follow. Ypres, the Somme, Passchendaele, Cambrai. They had survived the first test. But the real war was just beginning. When the guns fell silent at Mons, the noise didn't stop. It just moved inside the men who had survived. For weeks after the retreat, soldiers reported hearing phantom artillery in their sleep, the echo of shells that no longer existed. Some woke up shouting orders. Others woke up silent, unable to speak at all. They called it battle fatigue. Later generations would call it shell shock. The British expeditionary force that fought at Mons had been a professional army, disciplined, confident, trained for precision and order. But the trenches didn't care about precision. They cared about endurance. And the men who survived Mons learned that lesson first. In letters sent home during the winter of 1914, the tone had changed. Gone were the descriptions of brave charges and quick victories. Now there were just fragments. I can't forget the sound. I still see the canal when I close my eyes. We did what we could. That's all. The survivors became mentors for the waves of volunteers who arrived in 1915. Men from factories, farms, and cities, eager, patriotic, and unprepared. They looked up to the veterans of Mons with awe. They called them the Old Contemptibles, a name born from a rumor that Kaiser Wilhelm had referred to the British Army as a contemptible little force. Whether the Kaiser said it or not didn't matter. The name stuck. It became a badge of honor. The veterans wore it with quiet pride. They had faced the full weight of the German war machine and lived. But their pride was tempered by loss. They had seen friends torn apart by artillery, officers vanish mid-sentence, and towns burned to nothing. And they knew, deep down, that this was only the beginning. One corporal wrote from Ypres in 1915, "We thought Mons was the worst thing a man could endure. Now I know better. Mons was just the start. The trauma of that first battle never left them." Years later, many would say they could still smell the canal, oil, cordite, and blood mixed into the water. Some couldn't stand the sound of trains because the screech of steel on steel reminded them of shells overhead. Others never spoke of it at all. The British Army tried to study the phenomenon, to understand why some men broke and others didn't. They called it nervous exhaustion. But there was no vocabulary for what these soldiers were experiencing. There were no psychologists in the trenches, no treatment for nightmares. The men coped the only way they knew how, by keeping quiet and carrying on. And yet, beneath the silence, Mons had left its mark. It changed how the British Army fought. It changed how they trained. It changed how they viewed war itself. No more illusions of glory. No more talk of quick victories. Only the reality of survival. One day, one shell, one man at a time. By the end of 1915, few of the original veterans of Mons remained on the front line. Those who did were worn thin by months of rain and mud. But their presence anchored the new army, a living reminder of what had been endured. Every regiment had at least one old soldier who'd fought at Mons. When the new recruits doubted themselves, they'd say, "He was there, at the beginning." And that was enough. For the men who lived through Mons, the war never really ended. It followed them home, in dreams, in sounds, in the spaces between words. They carried it for the rest of their lives. By the time the guns fell silent over Mons, the world had changed forever. Few realized it then. But those 2 days in August 1914, a clash between a small British force and a vast German army, had marked the beginning of something far greater than a battle. It was the end of an age. Before Mons, generals still believed in movement, in cavalry charges, in banners, in glory. After Mons, all that was gone. The machine gun had rewritten the rules. And no empire, no general, no soldier would ever fight the same way again. German reports after the battle were stunned by what they had faced. They had expected an easy victory over what they called a contemptible little army. Instead, they met riflemen who fired with mechanical precision, 15 aimed shots a minute, so fast that German officers believed they were under machine gun fire. One officer wrote, "We thought we were facing hundreds of machine guns." It was only rifles, but fired by men who did not miss. That discipline cost the British dearly. They won time, but lost blood. The retreat from Mons was not a defeat. It was a delay. A delay that gave France the hours it needed to hold the Marne, and with it, to hold civilization itself. Historians later called it a small battle with a colossal shadow, because Mons was not about territory. It was about transition. The British Expeditionary Force, the last remnant of a 19th century army, had collided head-on with the 20th century. In the space of 48 hours, they learned that courage alone was no longer enough. Technology had taken control. Steel, fire, and industry now decided who lived and who died. By 1915, the lessons of Mons had become doctrine. Infantry no longer advanced in open lines. Cavalry was abandoned. Defensive positions were fortified with barbed wire, sandbags, and deep trench networks. Every attack was preceded by days of artillery bombardment, thousands of shells softening the ground, before men were sent to die upon it. The war that began at Mons would grind on for 4 years, consuming millions. And yet, among the survivors, Mons remained sacred. It was the first test, the moment when everything old broke and something new was born. Every soldier who fought there carried its name like a scar. When they met years later, in pubs or at remembrance parades, they spoke of it quietly, as if the memory itself demanded respect. In 1926, a monument was built near the canal at Nimy, where Lieutenant Dease and Private Godley had held their ground against the advancing Germans. Visitors still come to see it. They leave poppies at the base, read the names, and walk the quiet paths where the first shots of Britain's war were fired. The canal is calm now. No smoke, no noise, just the reflection of the trees on the water and the ghosts of those who stood there more than a century ago. The story of Mons is not one of victory or defeat. It is a story of endurance, of men who faced the impossible and refused to break. They fought not for glory, but for each other. And in that, they became immortal. Because every war begins with a moment like Mons, a moment when ordinary men stand against the storm, and history takes their names.